Right, good evening and welcome. This is the 7th session in the Free University of Brighton course, philosophy course, Plato and Deleuze. I'm going to talk about Simulacra and Dialectic today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to chat a little bit more about the Simulacra that we began to talk about last week, and that's going to be like the first half of the lecture, and then the second bit before the seminar I'm going to go through the Angler. And this is an example in the Sophist where they do the division method, part of the Dialectic. As we know, the Dialectic is made up of division and collection, and if we're reading it from Deleuze, division and collection, brackets and selection. So the first thing I want to do, though, is, as I say, I want to talk about Simulacra first. So the first thing I want to do is just read a passage from Deleuze. Let's just bring this up. It kind of sets the tone as to why the Simulacra matter. And I think that's it's always important to try and think why it matters. Now, this isn't going to clarify everything by any means, but it'll give us something perhaps to chat about in the next couple of weeks. So modernity is defined by the power of the simulacrum. And this is Deleuze's Logic of Sense. This is to page 265. It's towards the end of the first section of the essay, the Simulacrum and Ancient Philosophy, which we're looking at. Modernity is defined by the power of the simulacrum. It behooves philosophy not to be modern at any cost, no more than to be non-temporal, but to extract from modernity something that Nietzsche designated as the untimely, which pertains to modernity, but which must also be turned against it, in favour, I hope, of a time to come, which you can see is in quotes. That's a quote from Nietzsche. Deleuze continues, and for those of us who are reading the Phaedrus, this should sort of ring a bell in some ways. Deleuze continues, "It is not in the great forests and woodpaths that philosophy is elaborated, but rather in the towns and in the streets, even in the most artificial in them. The untimely is attained in relation to the most distant past by the reversal of Platonism, in relation to the present by the simulacrum conceived as the edge of critical modernity, and in relation to the future it is attained by the phantasm of the eternal return as belief in the future. The artificial and the simulacrum are not the same thing. They are even opposed to each other. The artificial is always a copy of a copy, which should be pushed to the point where it changes its nature and it's reversed into the simulacrum, the moment of pop art. Artifice and simulacrum are opposed at the heart of modernity." So I'm just going to show you that in a bit full screen. So modernity is defined by the power of the simulacrum. It behooves philosophy not to be modern at any cost, no more than to be non-temporal, but to extract from modernity something that Nietzsche designated as the untimely, which pertains to modernity, but which must also be turned against it, in favour, I hope, of a time to come. It is not in the great forests and woodpaths that philosophy is elaborated, but rather in the towns and in the streets, even in the most artificial in them. The untimely is attained in relation to the most distant past by the reversal of Platonism, and in relation to the present by the simulacrum conceived as the edge of critical modernity. So it's this bit here, in relation to the present, that I'm kind of wanting to talk about, I suppose, a bit today. So, simulacrum are the critical edge of modernity. So these lovely phrases that philosophers come up with, the critical edge of modernity. So this is on Logic of Sense, page 265. And it's part of that I was just reading to you. And he says at one point there that we should be looking for the artificial in towns, even in the most artificial in them, looking for the simulacrum in towns, even in the most artificial in towns. And obviously that kind of, I mean, this is written in the late 60s. I mean, now the example of things like what's the most artificial in towns, you know, the internet, the information highway, the virtual reality, all these kind of, TV, televisual entertainment, the interaction with streamers, the interaction with YouTubers, the interaction with Instagram and God knows what else, Facebook and all that kind of stuff, the most artificial in the towns, presumably, we would, I suppose, be happy to say that, maybe. I don't know. I kind of think it's possibly the most artificial in the towns. And so maybe we're looking at the simulacrum there. I mean, and this is the sense of what we had last time, in terms of positive connotations as well as negative. The part of the point of Deleuze raising the simulacrum is to sort of raise its positive power rather than just the negative that we find inside Plato. And so I think in some ways, we might. It's a very strange word, this simulacrum, and it's a very strange kind of project that Deleuze is engaged in. It's very deeply embedded inside philosophy. It might seem entirely abstract and out there, but I think there are ways in which, and people do this all the time, of course, there are ways in which these things can kind of be connected into examples in our everyday life that we're living now, that we're experiencing, and maybe have some insight into those things, And that's important, I think, for us to do. It's important for us to kind of, try and work out. I mean, philosophy is not an abstract game just for fun, although it can be. It also can be useful for trying to work out what's going on around us, and so it's obviously useful to do that. But at the same time, and this isn't to say that philosophy is a game, at the same time, just keeping an eye, just following the course of the thoughts themselves is important. And sometimes I think it's best if we try, when we're thinking about their application to everyday life, to think about that application to everyday life in terms of helping us to understand what the track of the thought is in the philosophy, rather than to try and use the philosophy to explain everyday life. It should be that everyday life, in a sense, it helps us to explain the philosophy. Otherwise we end up kind of often dropping what's most interesting in the philosophy for something that seems to give us an explanation of everyday life. So that's kind of by way of by way of warning that the next sort of 20 minutes or so are kind of probably a bit abstract, even in terms of our reading. I kind of want to just give an overview of what's going on in the Simulacrum and ancient philosophy. So that we can, for those of you who are reading it, you can maybe reread it a little bit and have another look. And for those of you who are just following the course, that we're just doing it in a little bit more detail. Sorry, I'm just responding to a quick message on River, which is a free University of Brighton communications platform where seminars and chat and forum takes place, if you're not sure. Okay, so to look at the Simulacrum and ancient philosophy as a kind of overall, one of the things, it's got two parts. That's the first thing. And the first part is explicit stuff around Plato and the ideas that we were talking about last week, and bringing up this concept, this power of the simulacrum. The second part switches and begins to talk about Lucretius and a concept of naturalism. And it might seem a bit sort of strange. Why are you banging the two together? One of the things that's kind of important is for us to try and think, why here are we finding Plato and Lucretius, or Plato idealism and Lucretius naturalism? So why are we kind of finding names and concepts sort of read against each other? And I think that's what's going on in Simulacrum and ancient philosophy. In the first part, we're kind of given a semi-critical relationship to Plato. In the second part, we're giving a semi-positive relationship to Lucretius. And I say semi because I'm not they're kind of readings, but they're not really assessments of either Plato or Lucretius. Now, in that first section, we essentially encounter this distinction between the artificial versus the simulacrum. And if you remember from last week, just to recap, we were talking about two types of relationships. This is in the first part of the essay, two types of relationships. A relationship of resemblance between the idea and the copy as the object, and the idea and the simulacrum as the object. And so the first type of relationship is a relationship of resemblance, the idea, copy, object. And the second is a resemblance of difference or divergence or disparity, which is the idea, and the simulacrum as the object. Now, what's going on here is not that one account is better necessarily than the other. What's being presented by Deleuze is a displacement of an account, a displacement of Plato, rather than a rejection. And remember, if he talks about the simulacrum in that first passage that I was sort of reading out, the first kind of move is the reversal of Platonism. The second kind of move is the use and the perception of the simulacrum in our present. So that first kind of move of the reversal of Platonism is what's taking place, and that reversal isn't a rejection. I mentioned this last week. So the artificial as a concept is, in a sense, this is the strategy displaced by the concept of the simulacrum. So we no longer think of things as being virtual in a negative sense. We also have positive connotations to them. We no longer think of things as artificial in a negative sense. We also have positive connotations to them. And as we have the positive connotations, they kind of enable us to think that, in a sense, that would be closer to what we mean by the positive connotation to the simulacrum. So what is all this? What is all this strategically, therefore? What is Deleuze trying to do with this essay? What is he trying to do with this distinction between the artificial and the simulacrum? Well, I mean, the easiest way is, and this is where it does get a little bit, abstract in a sense, the easiest answer to that is it's part of his project to think difference. Now that's a big grand sounding thing, but let's just simplify a little bit. So if Plato is a kind of a philosopher of identity, let's say the first philosopher of identity, and a whole series of philosophers then kind of follow on from Plato as philosophers of identity, so Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, etc., all the way up through Descartes in the modern era. We have these philosophers of identity, this kind of thread in which identity is your starting point, and difference might be sort of thought subsequent to that. What Deleuze's project is to try and think difference as primary, and to try and track that as a separate thread, one that didn't start with Plato, but one that's there all the way through philosophy as well. And so that's part of his strategy in terms of this displacement of Plato. So we have simulacrum and the ancient philosophy, and Plato is just half of it. Okay, he's just half of it. He's the thread that is located around thinking identity. Lucretius is the other half of this essay, naturalism, and that's kind of the thinking of difference. This is the way I think Deleuze is sort of setting us up for this essay. That's what you're reading when you're reading that particular essay, is this kind of strategic placing together of these two thinkers as a way of beginning to think difference, as a way of beginning to think the thread of thinking that thought difference. So let's just bring that up so you can see this. So this is Deleuze kind of expressing this, working this in the Logic of Sense essay, the Simulacrum and Ancient Philosophy. To think difference, let us consider the two formulas. Only that which resembles differs, and only differences can resemble each other. Now these are obviously quite we can go and explore these in very abstract kind of way. I mean, these are two formulas trying to organise sort of how things are put into relationships of resemblance, how they are kind of, not anything doesn't resemble anything else. It's not like just an open relationship. There's something that kind of brings some things in the world together into a relationship of resemblance. Now for Plato, that is the primary relationship, and for Deleuze, remember, the relationships that are underpinning the simulacrum, these relationships of difference, they also then produce relationships of resemblance secondarily, and then that would be the second one. Only differences can resemble each other, so only those primary kind of productional differences can resemble each other, whereas for Plato, it would be only that which resembles, only that which has some participation in the idea can differ from something else that has participation in the idea and resembles it as well. As I say, these are kind of, there's quite a lot of logical relationship work in these, and that we can go into, but perhaps not at this particular moment. But these two formulas are kind of set up as different ways of thinking. One thinking identity, one thinking difference. The first thinking identity, the second thinking difference. But what Deleuze says next is important. These are two distinct readings of the world. One invites us to think difference from the standpoint of a previous similitude or identity, whereas the other invites us to think similitude and even identity as the product of a deep disparity. Now, that last bit is a kind of way of replicating or re-saying something to do with the relationship, the logical relationship between those concepts of things like sameness and identity. But that bit in the middle, these are two distinct readings of the world, is important to bear in mind. It's important to bear in mind because in this project of the displacement of Plato, those different readings of the world are what we're actually discussing. It's not. I mean, we are discussing the details, obviously, of Plato. We're discussing the details of Deleuze a bit. We're discussing the details of particular texts. But what we're really discussing, or at least this is what Deleuze would argue, what we're really discussing are two distinct readings of the world, two distinct ways in which we can, as it were, be in the world or be with the world. So this strategy of displacement of Plato, that I think is the way in which we should read what Deleuze is doing here, we can break down the argument into sort of four different sort of stages, perhaps. In the first stage, the first thing that Deleuze is kind of establishing is that there are two relationships, not one, between ideas and objects, and that's the first thing to kind of get here. Is the first claim, if you like, is that there are two relationships, not one, between ideas and objects. The relationship of the copy and the relationship of the simulacra. Okay, but, and here's the important caveat, these two relationships are both able to be found inside Plato, and this is one of the things he's saying about the sophist, is we can find that second relationship of the simulacra inside the sophist. Now, whether we can or not is something we'll be looking at a little bit over the next couple of weeks, and in the seminar, for example. So that's the first sort of that's the first claim, first part of the argument that Deleuze is putting forward, that there are two relationships, not one, between ideas and objects, relationship of copy, relationship of simulacra, and both of these relations can be found inside Plato. The second part is relatively uncontroversial in a sense, which is that Plato is advocating for the copy relationship. He's actually promoting, he's not just, let's say, mentioning the copy relationship as something in his argument that he's discussing. He's advocating for it. He's in favour of the copy relationship. He's kind of putting it forward as a good account of the world. The third claim, again, not particularly uncontroversial, although actually maybe it is. But his third claim is that ancient philosophy is more diverse than just Plato. Where does that claim come from? Well, this is, I think, one of the things that we're seeing inside the way in which the Plato and Lucretius are put together inside Simulacrum and Ancient Philosophy, that essay that's the appendix in Logic of Sense that we've been looking at. I mean, one of the things that's being implied there is it's not just Plato we should look at, it's Lucretius as well. It's not just this one is this one. Now, there are, kind of strange little mottos you learn as you sort of study and train in philosophy. One of which is the idea that all of philosophy is just footnotes on Plato, and this is a kind of motto or slogan you kick around, and it's often stated with a kind of bravado, or often stated with some sort of pride that everything we're doing goes all the way back to Plato and he's this genius, and we're all just discussing stuff that he'd already discussed, and even if he hadn't solved it all, we're just kind of footnotes with elements that can continue his conversation. And I think that's a kind of massively problematic reading of philosophy and of Plato, and so I think that when we say that it's uncontroversial to say that ancient philosophy is more diverse than just Plato, actually there are quite strong prejudices to the idea inside philosophy, strong prejudices to the idea that philosophy is just Plato onwards, sort of thing. Anyway, so that's the third part of the argument. Now, the fourth part is that this diversity that Deleuze is locating includes explicit advocates of the simulacrum. Now, I think I don't want to necessarily add the rest of the argument here in that form, but that structure, I think, we can kind of, find working inside both the first argument, both the first essay that we read by Deleuze on the Greeks and the second one, the Simulacrum and Ancient Philosophy. This argument that essentially what it's trying to do is it's trying to make us realise that Plato is engaged in an active dispute. Okay, an active dispute, and can be read best as engaged in an active dispute between the idea of the copy and the idea of the simulacrum. Not that this is somehow a reading, into Plato, but I think the idea is that this is almost like the best way of reading Plato, is engaged in this active dispute, an active dispute that we can see when we read other philosophers like Lucretius with different kind of metaphysical backgrounds. And so when we're looking at Lucretius in the essay, The Simulacrum and Ancient Philosophy, what we're seeing is Lucretius as a sort of stand-in for a concept of naturalism, or a philosophical position of naturalism, and the further sort of idea that this position actually puts forward as the best model of objects, the idea of the simulacra. So that, I think, is kind of how I would strategically suggest you look at what's going on in that essay by Deleuze. But there is a kind of next, let's say that was a kind of okay-ish way of reading the essay. There is something we want to extract from this, which is, Deleuze is not reading Lucretius as a kind of interpreter. He's not a good reader of Lucretius. Lucretius probably says lots and lots of stuff that just wouldn't be compatible with the way in which Deleuze is necessarily reading him. And Deleuze is doing what he often does when he reads philosophers. He's using them a bit like a ventriloquist uses a kind of character to articulate a particular kind of idea, but usually those ideas can kind of be found inside the philosopher. So let's just first of all have that warning about the way Deleuze reads stuff. But even if we would just, and I think it might be better, even if we were to use the word naturalism, and by naturalism I mean a philosophy that's kind of in line with and follows closely natural laws, physics and science and things like that. That's a kind of naturalism, even an ancient philosophy. So one that sort of has pays attention to the sort of discoveries that we encounter. So even inside this, even if we just take it as naturalism, we just take it as a kind of philosophical position, the argument does seem to be that Deleuze is putting forward is that this naturalism advocates simulacra as a positive account of objects, a positive account of the way to understand the world, a way to read the world. Now, the way in which it does that, I think, is what's kind of interesting for us, and we'll kind of connect in a little bit to the way in which we see division taking place inside the sophists. So the sort of second part of this lecture and some of what we were doing in the seminar. So how does naturalism advocate simulacra? Again, short answer, via diversity. Okay, via diversity. A slightly longer answer. Let's look at it in a slightly more sort of, let's look at it in a little bit more detail, and again, this is not a lot of detail, but the way in which diversity operates is essentially it's connected intimately to the definition of what's natural, and this is Deleuze. So point A, the products of nature are inseparable from a diversity which is essential to them. Now that we can see in a sense is this kind of reading of beginning with difference, beginning with diversity rather than identity. And the second, so this is a kind of axiomatic claim almost. It's a kind of starting point or a principle almost. So this way of reading through identity or reading through difference, they're almost like two fundamentally different starting points involved in them. And this is a kind of starting point that would be the reading of difference. The products of nature are inseparable from a diversity which is essential to them. So there's a kind of necessary connection built in there. And the second point is the one that begins to be a little bit interesting. Natural diversity arises in three aspects: diversity of species, the diversity of individuals (brackets) which are members of the same species. So we can already see a connection between the species, and then individuals which are part of them, And then the diversity of parts, which together compose an individual. So again, we can see a kind of a nesting relationship almost. It's not quite a nesting relationship in which species are the big things made up of individuals, which themselves are made up of parts. So this kind of interesting process where if we begin from difference and we kind of just happily begin from difference, we can immediately begin to generate something that looks interesting in terms of what we might call an ontology or an understanding of the world. Something that looks interesting and perhaps compatible with stuff we know in other fields of knowledge. So that natural diversity in species, individuals and parts, this kind of nesting relationships, these kind of sort of intimate relationships between what Deleuze calls three intertwined aspects of diversity. All of these can sort of begin to be produced as parts of our reading of the world if we begin with difference. Now obviously there's a whole argument that we can have about where we should begin, and that's a kind of separate argument. But we kind of, if we take it that we've begun with difference, we can generate some interesting categories that are quite different from the ones generated by Plato. Specifically, we can generate these categories of specificity, individuality, and heterogeneity. And here's all kind of what's going on at this point is once we begin to generate a kind of ontological metaphysical account of the world, this reading of the world that begins with difference rather than identity, there are a series of things that Deleuze then kind of generates that go along with this and that kind of fill out the picture. So here's another one. Things exist one by one without any possibility of their being gathered together all at once. Now, we can kind of, in this relationship between species, specificity, individuals, individuality, and the parts that individuals are made up of, heterogeneity, we can begin to kind of, because they're sort of nested parts, and we can have this kind of weird, complex sense of them being very, very, interrelated, very, very complexly interrelated. The idea of being able to get to a point at which everything was kind of, graspable, understood, perfectly clear, the all at once, may actually not just be a kind of element of the way we know the world, may be an element of the world itself. This is what's being said here. And that the way the world exists is as it says, by one. So in this kind of temporal relationship of each step making a difference, rather than this block universe we sometimes hear about, which is the all-at-once universe. We have a universe that kind of unfolds step by step. So immediately these kind of different metaphysical ontologies, these different ways of reading the world, we can see, generate things or generate kind of statements, or are able to at least generate the frame for statements that are consistent, that look like they might have some relevance. Mathematics and science and particular forms of physics generate notions of block universes, for example. So we're generating something that immediately seems to sort of, in some sense, at least be generating conflict with that idea. But more broadly speaking, that kind of phrase that things exist one by one without any possibility of their being gathered together all at once, it's basically a claim that totalization of nature is impossible. That nature can't be summed up. You can't sum it all up. So it's a kind of claim against an idea that there's some possibility of having a finished, finalised, absolute, clear and true theory of everything, in which every aspect of nature is going to be completely kind of understood, brought under a totality of a sort of theory or framework. What's being argued for here is actually that there's ragged edges, there's bits that are moving continuously, that there's always an absence, always a kind of failure in some sense of our knowledge and our theory and our model. There's no possibility of that totalization. And part of the reason for this is kind of key to this idea of what's going on in if we read the world from the starting point of difference, what's going on in the world. And one of the differences that's placed there by Deleuze is that the world becomes, or this reading of the world makes the world distributive rather than collective. The laws of nature, he says, distribute parts which cannot be totalized. And this is in some sense one of the most difficult but also one of the most interesting elements between the two kind of conflictual models, the one that starts with identity and the one that starts with difference, is they both generate ontologies of the world, ways in which the world are, readings of the world, that can in some sense be in some sense like posed as in contrast to each other in terms of their dynamism, in terms of their movement, which is often why people like Deleuze or Nietzsche or something, are thought of as philosophers of becoming, and people like Plato are often thought of as philosophers of being, where being is a kind of static, fixed, summed it all up, completely totalized, whole picture kind of understanding of knowledge or the way things work, the reading of the world, as opposed to a much more step by step, one by one, unfolding account of the world, in which there isn't any possibility of summing up, totalizing, because not only the future being open, but the past is always fragmentary. There's no kind of clear edges in this other kind of model, and that other model looks, in some sense, like it also has the capacity to be closer. This is the idea, the capacity to be closer to those kind of things we encounter in our scientific and empirical work, our scientific and empirical knowledge. Now, as we can probably work out, there's actually going to be a lot more of a complex relationship between this kind of metaphysics of difference and science and naturalism than is initially perhaps thought, at least by Deleuze. Right, so because as Machinadas mentioned in the chat, there's already inside mathematics and physics all sorts of what we might think of as Platonic kind of models, and counters to Platonic kind of models. So the block universes versus, as Machinadas mentions, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. There's all sorts of strange kind of ideas kicking around in maths and physics that already seem to embody part of this kind of difference. Some of them being closer to identity, some of them being closer to difference kind of thoughts, difference readings, and I think this is probably the best way of trying to get to grips with what Deleuze is doing. Is I do think he's advocating a differential reading, this kind of displacement of Plato in favour of an ontology or a metaphysics of difference. But at the same time, one of the things that we can do, even if we don't agree with Deleuze, is track these two kind of ways of reading the world through philosophy, and in doing so we can also track some of their kind of echoes inside science and other disciplines, inside of other ways in which we understand the world. We can kind of track these kind of two different ways of reading the world in any reading of the world. And I think that's where Deleuze can be useful in this particular situation, can give us a good critical tool. Anyway, I'm going to take a couple of minutes break there. So it's 7:34 according to my computer, so I'm going to break for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back. So have a bit of a stretch. Have a bit of a stretch. Have a drink, and we'll be back in 5. Okay, let's get back to it. I just realised actually I should do something like put on some music or some note or something in the chat when I have a break, because obviously someone tuning in at that point might not be very it won't be very clear what's going on other than some strange picture on the screen. So yeah, a strange picture on the screen. So let's just put that back up again and I'll show you that bit. So this is last week we were talking in the seminar and in the lecture about diagrams, and about using diagrams as a way of beginning to think the kind of connections between some of the concepts, the relationships, the way they might kind of be organised for us. And we had a couple of diagrams placed into the river chat, which was great. Hopefully you might get a moment to look at them tonight. That would be interesting. And I think we had 3 in there, and I drew one just from this stuff. And so this is the diagram to do with me thinking through these 3 intertwined aspects of natural diversity. This is the kind of, we start with difference, we start with we start with that kind of essential connection, between natural products and diversity, which seems kind of, that seems okay. I'm quite happy with that kind of concept. We kind of, I think, see that in the way in which stuff grows, it is produced. But we can argue about that, but let's not worry too much. But that starting point of this, products of nature are inseparable from the diversity, and then that diversity sort of is threefold, 3 intertwined aspects. And so this is what this is looking at, these 3 intertwined aspects. So this is the first one, the species. And so what I was just, this was just my sort of way of thinking, the natural phylum, the kind of way species break and develop, very simply, it's a little bit like these kind of lines that I've drawn here. So that's a kind of species development. The individual, so that gave me a sense of what was meant by, natural diversity in terms of specificity. Obviously, specificity is each of these lines at the end is a sort of specific species. Specificity is what's produced at this end of the diagram, as it were. And then the individual. So the individual to me was, and obviously there may be major errors here. Don't worry about that. That's not the point of the diagram. The point of the diagram is to enable you to think through some stuff. So the individual, So the individual is going to exist at a particular moment in a species. And that's going to be something. It's going to be a kind of part of a. If this way of understanding things, we can call. Let's call that the long view, and this is the sort of momentary view, or the present, if you like. Then the individual is going to exist in a kind of present in relationship to the species as a whole. So they're going to kind of cut it at a particular moment, and then the individual themselves. I had to kind of push outside of the diagram, and it becomes this thing. So that's the parts that make up the go up to make up the individual. So this line is made up a whole series of these kind of objects all the way through it. And I thought, well, that's kind of okay-ish. Species individuation parts, SIP. That's just. Again, these are just ways of you thinking through stuff in your head. And then I thought, well, that's kind of, is that right? So this is a just, nested situation. Again, circles, so this would be the kind of parts that make up the individual, that make up the species. And obviously, this is just done in terms of them being lots of them. And then just words that kind of seemed important to me in relationship to this particular kind of setup: inclusion, exclusion. So there's a point at which something goes down that path and not down that path, is included in that and excluded from that. There's a point at which something is included in the individual. There's a point at which an individual crosses a species or is part of an individual, is included in the species. So inclusion, exclusion seemed to be important, as did merge and divide. So all I was doing here, in a sense, is trying to think how I might get to grips with or get to understand that sense of natural diversity arriving in 3 intertwined aspects. Now, one of the things it did do, though, is it did seem to me that, in particular, this kind of the way in which we're specifying, the way in which we're breaking a species down into, smaller and smaller groups, not individuals, smaller and smaller groups that have kind of a set of relationships and are distinct from another one. The way in which is the process of specification. One of the ways in which that's going on, obviously, is connected to the stuff that's taking place inside the sophist. Now, we encountered in the Phaedrus the way of specifying through definition, and then working out, as it were, what occurs afterwards. So particular definitions of love, for example, or the definitions of a good speaker or good writer. When we're looking to identify something, or to and that's the word we use. When we're trying to kind of specify what's specific about this thing rather than that thing. We're going to kind of separate things out. We're trying to sort of separate out. We're trying to make divisions, which is the process in dialectic of division, this separating out, this making cuts. And what happens in the sophist, and the first kind of big move of the sophist, is precisely this exercise that someone is taken through before they look at what the sophist is. They're taken through this exercise in finding the angler, hunting down the angler through this process of dialectic, this process of specification, in order to identify exactly what the angler is. We can also redescribe that in order to differentiate accurately what the angler is. Now, the two different things, to identify the angler or to differentiate the angler, the two different things, right, in some sense can be the same, but also reflect kind of partly this different readings of the world that can be given through identity or difference. So I'm going to kind of talk about differentiating. Okay, differentiating out. And the way in which this kind of operates, for those of you who've had a look at the sophist, this is on section 219a through to 221b, and you can have a look at that in the sophist yourself, and sort of track through what I'm saying. It should be fairly easy to find it. But the way this works inside the sophist is, I think, worth both visualizing and thinking about, because it is this process of differentiation that's going to be very useful to us later when we're looking at Deleuze's productivist account of difference. So the first thing they do is talk about whether the angler knows something or doesn't know something, and in my translation they use the notion of an expert. Are they an expert or not an expert in something? Sorry. Now that kind of sets us up for what's going to happen. So there's going to be an inclusion and an exclusion. Okay, so there's going to be like a pair of things, one of which the object is included in and one of which it's kind of separated out from. And that's the process of division for inclusions and exclusions. So they agree that it's an expert, and then they go to the next sort of major category. Does it produce or acquire? Is it part of production or acquisition? And that itself is a kind of interesting, very interesting distinction. And there's lots of other things we might want to explore in that. I'll put it up on the screen a bit. I'll just bring it full screen for you just briefly. But I'm not going to spend a long time on this. But that distinction between production and acquisition, one of the things that was interesting is acquisition it often seems to be very closely connected to human actions and human words. They take things that have come into being and they take possession of some of them with words and actions, and they keep others from being taken possession of other objects. There's a kind of, to me, one of the things it hints, and there's other elements of it during the division, is there's a kind of cultural background at work inside these divisions, some of which I can kind of get, others seem a little bit odd, and so that is also something we need to bear in mind when we're going through these. But let's just go through them, because I think it's worth us seeing it and seeing what's going on. So we go from production to acquisition, and it's on the side of acquisition. It's getting something. There are two different kinds of acquisition. There's exchange acquisition and taking possession acquisition, and it's on the taking possession side. Then they go through the rest of them, and relatively quickly. So taking possession is divided into combat and hunting. It's on the hunting side. Hunting is divided into hunting lifeless things and living things. It's on the living things side. It's on you hunt living things on land or at sea. It's on the sea side. The things that you hunt at sea are winged birds and stuff, or they're underwater. It's on the underwater side. Things you hunt underwater, you hunt with nets or you hunt with striking. It's on the striking side. And things you hunt with striking, you hunt with a spear go down or a hook coming up, striking up. And so the angler is that which strikes up. So each time. And I think this is kind of what we're wanting to really. This is what I really wanted to indicate. I mean, obviously we can discuss each particular split can be discussed. Each one can be discussed and maybe debated. But what's more important, in a sense, is just to look at the way in which the method operates. So we go down these green paths, and each time we do that, we kind of kick out something. We exclude something. We're excluded from. And what we're doing is, is in the process of doing this, one of the things we could say we're doing is we're distributing differences. Okay, we're distributing, these are all differences, and we're coordinating them together in such a way that we can differentiate out this specific difference. Now, second thing, obviously these red things, they're alternative paths. In the process of differentiating out each point, we produce a kind of different path, an alternative path. And then there's a wider kind of idea of, in these processes, which I think is definitely there in Plato, in these processes of differentiating out specific differences, like the angler, through this process of division, we end up with a whole series of these tables, if you like, these paths, these like little trees that might be formed, and there should be some sort of consistency between one division we make and another. And so these kind of elements of this distribution of the difference, the fact that there are alternative paths and that there's a kind of impulse or need for consistency between the different divisions, all of these seem to offer us a relatively interesting kind of method. Now the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and whether this method actually works, whether it's useful, is another question. I think it's definitely worth playing with it and trying it out. And I think it's one of the things that's kind of most noticeable about it, and this I think comes down to this this kind of question about which way to read the world, between identity or difference. One of the things that's most noticeable about the process of division, this kind of distribution that takes place, this continuous distribution that takes place of differences, is the humanness of each move, the cultural and human specificity of each move. Whilst they're understandable, whilst I'm reading through them and I can get to grips with them, I also can feel that these are not logical divisions. These are not divisions in some abstract world. These are divisions made between activities. The hunting of living things and lifeless things. What the hell is the hunting of lifeless things? I immediately want to think, and then we can go down that rabbit hole, and that's kind of. That's great, and that offers us lots of little routes to go thinking. But the most important thing is that kind of is that the fact that the distinctions between, when we get to like the hunting of living things, the hunting between things that are on land and aquatic, things that are winged or underwater, these are distinctions between practices that humans have. These are not distinctions between abstract categories or abstract ideas. These are not referencing me back to some idea in a transcendent realm outside of time, in a Platonic sense of the form or the idea. These are things that I can encounter in my everyday experience. These are empirical differences, not metaphysical logical differences. And these are, in most cases. So that's kind of one thing that's really important. These are kind of human differences, not abstract differences, that are being distributed across there. And at the same time, there are inside them certain kind of abstract differences as well. The differences between exchange and taking possession. There are kind of things that are cultural formations, we might say, ways of doing stuff. That also are kind of encoded into this distribution, that these kind of divisions can track out. So I think sometimes that might be the more interesting route in some sense, is to kind of track out the things that humans distinguish themselves from each other by. Most of the time it's not some abstract idea. Most of the time it is these relatively practical empirical examples, and using that to try and work through the sophist is going to be an interesting shift. It's going to bring us into the realm of possibly some of the most abstract stuff to do with being and non-being. But it's worth remembering at this point, particularly as you try and deal with that in the sophist, that these division processes are not themselves in some high realm of logical form and Platonic transcendence. These are, distinctions and divisions that are rooted in our encounter with the world, and rooted in the way in which we already read the world. Okay, so that's what we're going to do inside the seminar, is go through some of these examples and try and make some ourselves. So if you're from the Free University of Brighton and you're on River, that's what we're going to be having a look at in the seminar. And I'll open the seminar. In fact, it's open at the moment, but it won't be starting until 8 o'clock. If you're reading through with the rest of the course, or if you're on the Free University of Brighton and you're reading, the reading for next week is to continue reading the Sophist. Depending on how far you've got, you should have at least begun to encounter some of it by now. Ideally, to have finished the 2 bits of Deleuze we've had a look at already, just read through them if you get a chance, and to move to the next one, to have done with judgment. That's again for people from the Free University of Brighton. That's again, it's on our River. It's in one of the topics there. You can find the reading. So that's the reading for next week. Continue reading the Sophist and read Deleuze's To Have Done with Judgment. This is a chapter from the book What is Philosophy, I believe. Or is it? No, sorry. It's a chapter from the book Essays, Critical and Clinical. So that's for next week. I will we'll continue talking a little bit about a good bit of being. Yeah, we'll have a good bit of being soon. We're going to continue talking about Simulacrum, and we will begin to kind of deal a little bit with this last final problem of being and non-being that's dealt with in the Sophist. So that's the last 3 weeks, but do bear that in mind, that this kind of, it is best if you just read along, read some of the stuff with it. That's kind of partly how the lectures are organised. So they can be understood on their own, but you're probably going to get more if you're having a look at the texts. Okay, and obviously if you're not in the Free University of Brighton, you're welcome to use Discord. That is available on my Twitch page. You can find a link there. Thank you very much, everybody. That's it for tonight. I'll catch you next week with the 8th session. And I might actually see some of you online if you're around later, because it's World of Warcraft begins today, and so about 11 o'clock I'll be streaming World of Warcraft, I expect, as we wait for the new expansion to drop and get completely caught in some godforsaken collapsing of artificial worlds over in a place called Azeroth. Alright, so I will see you later. Thanks a lot, everybody.